Hi, everyone. I am Jacqueline Rice Nelson, CEO and co-founder of Tribe AI, a flex talent network of top machine learning engineers and data scientists. Welcome to our Applied AI series with Scale, a set of conversations around how machine learning is accelerating change across industries. Today, I'm here with Ben Mabey, the CTO of Recursion, an innovative public drug discovery company. Ben, I'm now going to embarrass you a little bit. Ben is a data scientist and researcher by training. He originally joined Recursion in 2017 as lead research data scientist, and then led the engineering team before becoming the official CTO of Recursion, a career journey we will definitely have to come back to today. I'm so excited to have Ben with us because not only is Recursion an incredible company with an incredible mission, developing drugs for fibrosis, oncology, neuroscience, and many other rare diseases. But I've also had a chance to get to know Ben's tech team and see their supercomputing capabilities up close and personal when we worked together on a Tribe and Recursion project to increase GPU cluster efficiency. I'm a huge fan of the work they do and excited to talk about all of it today. So Ben, just to ground our conversation, I think we'll plan to focus, you'll have to keep me honest because I tend to go rogue. We'll try to focus on three core topics. The first, how machine learning is driving change in drug discovery and where Recursion fits into the ecosystem. The second is how to build a successful applied AI company based on research, something that as a cynical investor, guilty, doesn't always seem possible. And then third, Ben, your amazing career path from IC researcher and data scientist to CTO of a hugely successful public biotech company. Welcome. I'm so pumped for this conversation. I will confess one more time, not only am I a cynical investor, but I'm a cynical investor who really, until our work together, didn't know much about drug discovery. So just to kind of level set everyone listening in, maybe just tell us a bit about how this typically works in the pharma industry and how Recursion's taking a different approach.
I'll share a story because people love stories, and I'll share like the origin story of Recursion because it actually captures well how the traditional approach works and quite frankly doesn't work oftentimes. About in December of 2014, Chris Gibson, our co-founder, he published a paper along with Dean Li, also a co-founder of Recursion, who's now the president of Merck Research Labs. They published a paper on a rare disease called cerebral cavernous malformation. It was done using a new technology at the time called phenotypic screening. I'm going to back up a little bit because prior to that, that lab had been working on this rare disease for about 10 years. So Chris kind of showed up late to the game, and they ran some animal models with some lead candidates that they thought really promising. And they thought it was really promising. They did all this research around the underlying biology of this disease. And so they really thought with high confidence, they knew what was going on and how to fix it. But after they ran these disease models, it didn't pan out. And so for many in the lab, that was like very, it was disappointing, obviously, but it was also kind of like old hat. Like this is how science works. You try something, you may spend several years and it doesn't pan out, and you try again. You pick up another idea and you work through that. But for Chris, like it was very, it was just so eye-opening to him, like that so much time could be spent on failure. And he was curious if this new approach being talked about, this phenotypic high content imaging, phenotypic screens could address that. And so they tried that. And so what they did was they ran around 2,000 compounds with this approach. And using it, they were able to find compounds that actually worked. And they did that in a much shorter time period, right? We're talking about probably like a tenth of the time. And the way it worked was instead of using what often happens in drug discovery, if you have an idea and you think a disease is happening a certain way, you will create an assay. An assay is like a fancy word for like a set of procedures you run in a lab. You run an experiment essentially with a readout, and that readout could be something like cell count. It's very often the case that these readouts are low dimensional or sometimes even univariate in that case. You run these to see if your idea holds true. But this alternative approach, this phenotypic approach with high content imaging in particular, you're not taking a single readout, you're getting a high dimensional readout. And so what they did was different parts of the cell, different organelles were stained with different stains and then fluoresced, and then images were taken. And so based on that, the dimensions of each cell was measured, the area, everything about the morphology was captured in this high dimensional readout. And so that I'm just comparing and contrasting that's low dimensional to high dimensional. Anyways, that's what worked in this case. And what was kind of mind-blowing to Chris at the time was that how agnostic it really was. It wasn't just meant for this one particular disease, but you could actually scale this to lots of diseases. And so the question in his mind was, what if we did scale it? And that's kind of what the genesis of Recursion was. I joined in 2017, so 3 years after that. And at the time, we had these visions of running on the whole genome and running it on like millions of compounds, hundreds of thousands of cytokines. And that's really what has happened since then. And in the 6 years, we've done that. We've run things against the whole genome across millions of compounds. And that's what has created what we are now calling maps of biology, because they give us kind of a flashlight into the areas of biology that we haven't been able to see before. Anyway, so that gives you a real life example of what traditional drug discovery does still look like, which is why we see so many failures today, contrasted to Recursion's approach, which is really meant to accelerate the drug discovery process. And what I've just alluded to is the early part of drug discovery, the hit identification part.
What an incredible journey. And my gosh, it just struck me when you said sort of just in 6 years. It's just, I think like speed is clearly at the core of Recursion.
It feels like a lot longer than 6 years. It reminds me, there's this quote, I think it was by Bill Gates. People overestimate what they can do in a year, but they underestimate what can be done in a decade. And I think that is so true with technology-enabled drug discovery, which is the area that Recursion sits in. Like so much change is happening, and yet I think people, when they look at it like on, quarter to quarter, they don't see it happening. But I think it's going to be something we look back on, similar to mRNA. That was like, everyone was kind of poo-pooing that up until a little thing called COVID-19 happened, and everyone in the world needed it. So I just think it's kind of amazing the progress you can make if you hold true to your mission and just push really hard.
So maybe tell us a bit more about how the mission plays into how Recursion operates and how you might even define the mission.
We have a very bold mission. It's to decode biology to radically improve lives. And so, there's those two components. The radically improved lives is central to most every, pharma company out there, and that you want to create therapeutics for patients that will improve their quality of living, right? The other part, the decode biology, that's something that's a little more unique and specific to Recursion. Like we want to understand biology because it's so complex. We want to use AI to break it down so that we can find novel areas. Because what happens so much is reductionist views, like I just was talking about in the origin story of Recursion. They had some hypothesis about how that disease worked, but in the end, it was too reductionist. They didn't take into account all the other interactions that was happening in biology. And so we really wanted to break that down and capture enough biology so that we can, in essence, decode it.
What attracted you to Recursion in the first place? How'd you end up here?
Yeah, so my background is in software engineering, machine learning. Early on in my career, I was very focused on learning. I love building high-performance systems. I love building machine learning models. I don't know if people remember, but like when ensemble models were kind of the hot new thing, I totally geeked out on that. And like I built this system that would return in very low latency response times. And I really geeked out on that. I loved it. However, at a certain point in my career, just becoming better at something felt a little hollow for me personally. I wanted what I was doing to improve the world. And that amazing system I talked about, that was for ads. So I was optimizing so people would click on stuff that would make money for the company, and maybe it would make their lives better. I don't know. Ultimately, I did not feel good about using what I considered my superhero's power, right? We all have superhero powers. And for me, that was tech and machine learning. And I wanted to use that for something not to just make money. When I was looking around at different companies, Recursion just stuck out to me as a company who was really grounded in the mission. And it was so audacious that I knew I could not do that alone. I could do other startups by myself, which is something I considered. But a company that was going to require massive amounts of capital to generate the data required to do this problem, that was cool to me and appealing. Because it was also around the time, deep learning was really taking off. ImageNet had kind of rocked the world. And so I knew this wave of disruption was coming from deep learning. And so I wanted to be at a company who could create a data moat, if you will, that could really set it apart. And so Recursion was already investing in their robotics laboratory. And so the automation and the audaciousness of the mission and the fact that I could actually use my skills to do good in the world, all of that kind of made me want to join Recursion. And I'm super glad I did. It's been quite the ride so far.
I feel like I could take us down so many threads right now. I just love what you said with like I mean, certainly technologists have these incredible superpowers, and how do we use them to sort of drive the world forward, make the world a better place? I think that is one of the things personally that gets me so excited to work with engineers and technologists, because fundamentally you're builders, and the world you want to build has to be better than the one we have today. And so I deeply relate to that. I think many people listening will as well. My gosh, what a worthwhile mission you did choose. You touched on robotics, you touched on computer vision and deep learning. Maybe you could sort of take us in a bit more detail into sort of how some of these technological approaches and sort of building a data moat actually sort of, and of course, I realize there are going to be things you can't talk about, but for the things you can, maybe just share sort of how some of those approaches are actually applied at Recursion.
Probably something worthwhile talking about is how we've moved from this original screening approach. What we talked about in this paper, they screened 2,000 compounds against this one disease. At Recursion, we call that brute force screening, where you take every combination of disease and compound and you screen it. It's quadratic. We've since moved to a place where instead of screening all of those combinations, we instead just screen the marginals. So we screen every gene knockout, for example, to give us like a spanning space for biology. And then we screen compounds. And as a result, we screen far less. But what we're then able to do is then make inferences around what would happen if this particular disease was treated with this compound, or how similar is this gene to this other gene. And so that navigating of biology with maps, that's where the terms come from. That's really central to how Recursion operates today. And it's all built on what your listeners are, I'm sure, familiar with, is like embedding spaces, But instead of doing it in natural images or natural language text, we're doing it with biological images. It's the same math, right? Like you can look at cosine similarities to find out what's similar, what's not similar, and basically try and figure out what should your next experiment be to actually validate that. So that's one example of how we're using deep learning within our pipeline right now.
As you've been talking, I've been thinking a lot about what it must be like to have failure and like the acceptance of failure be so central to a company. I find particularly with like type A people in general, failure, despite how often we talk about embracing it and fail fast, it's still seen as a bad thing. And of course, you're trying to succeed. You're not trying to fail, but it feels like the recognition is that failure is part of that process. And what you're trying to do is speed up the failure occurrences such that you can get to those sort of success outcomes. How does that like have ripple effects through the company? And am I even sort of interpreting that correctly?
I mean, failure is definitely part of, yeah, you're right. It's part of life, but definitely part of drug discovery. And with 90% failure rate, it's a low bar. Like we don't have to do that much better to improve things. I think failure in general, just like from a philosophical standpoint, it's a way that you can learn. And like when I think back at like how Recursion has grown as a company, some of the biggest shifts we've made as a company is because we had like a long string of failures that we kept learning from. For example, like right now, when we knock out the genome to create these like maps of human biology, we are doing so with CRISPR. But CRISPR was not our main mode of knocking down genes. It wasn't our tool of choice up until relatively recently. Before that, we used something called sRNA, which one of our ML scientists describes as a genetic bomb, because it would knock down the gene, but it would knock down a whole bunch of other things. And so you would have to deal with these on-target effects, which were desired, and then a whole host of off-target effects. And so what we ended up doing for years was just computationally try to figure out how to extract the signal from the noise there. And we got pretty good at it, all things considered, but it was, compared to CRISPR, it was failure. But like, because of that hard failure that we pushed through and we worked through it, those challenges, we ended up being able to use CRISPR and other tools much more effectively. And so, on the order of like, we went from, I remember, we could understand the relationships between genes around like a 10% level with this other approach. But once we switched over to CRISPR, we're looking at more like 50 or 60%. And again, I don't think that would have happened if we hadn't embraced the failure or the challenge rather of this other approach early on. I don't think we saw it as a failure until we really switched over and we saw how drastic of a change it was. But it's important as you're building a company to be able to make those sort of hard decisions, and it will feel scary at the time, but like you just have to say, like, in 1 year from now, will things be better? And so the decision is actually easy to make, even though that at the time it can feel scary.
First of all, it's fascinating to sort of even hear how the technologies you've used and the approaches have evolved in a short period of time. But I'm sort of also just really struck by the fact that you're really bringing together kind of best-in-class technology, deep learning, and CRISPR, all these incredible approaches. It feels like that is really where the magic has been for Recursion, the sort of speed, the operating sort of through massive amounts of biological data. I think I read somewhere they were running 2.2 million experiments a week. Is that true?
Yeah. So our labs is capable to run up to 2.2 million experiments per week. And that's really, we need that kind of scale to speed our machine learning process, right? Like, you want to be able to iterate quickly because data is what fuels machine learning these days.
I'm also hearing kind of like this very scientific approach and being unbiased and sort of grounded in the data. And then, of course, I think one of the things that also makes you really unique is that you have the computing power to process all of this data, right? You have these incredibly powerful supercomputers.
It used to be a top 100, actually just unfortunately is now 106, I think. But we have one of the world's fastest supercomputers, and we use that for internal model training. And then, like, for our production workloads, when we're actually taking the images and then embedding them into our representation space done in Google Cloud, then that way we can leverage, best of both worlds. We spin up spot instances when we need to and tear them down. But for our training that we'd like to see always going, we use the more cost-effective on-premise supercomputer.
You touched on COVID. I know you all sort of played a role in sort of COVID response as well, and also are kind of like constantly pushing into sort of new diseases and sort of therapeutic spaces. Anything you want to touch on there?
Yeah, like I said, the platform, just like Chris kind of envisioned early on and recognized, is fairly agnostic. And so while the rare diseases, these Mendelian diseases where one gene knockout yields the disease, it proved to be a gateway drug into maps of biology. But the platform itself, you can really model, as long as you can model the disease within cells at the cellular level, you can use our platform to find treatments for. And so we've done that in, like you mentioned, oncology and other complex diseases such as fibrosis for our Bayer partnership. We've also done it with like C. difficile, which is an infectious disease, and also COVID. So early on in the pandemic, I think it was around April, 2020, we created some disease models. We couldn't do it in our lab. We had to go to a bio level 3 safety lab. We created some disease models, but within 4 weeks, we were able to screen, I think it was around 1,800 or so compounds, FDA compounds, to see what would be efficacious against COVID-19. Since then, there have been clinical randomized trials on those compounds. And of the ones we ran, 8 out of the 9 predictions we made held up to be true. And so we view that as like a really solid proof point about our platform. Within 4 weeks, we could tell people, what was going to work and what wasn't. Of course, there was some error there, but again, 90% is the bar here. And so as long as you can speed that up and really reduce the amount of failures you see down in the pipeline, you're doing a good job. And that's really the strategy behind Recursion. The drug discovery funnel, you can imagine like a V. At each stage, it becomes more and more costly to fail a drug. And so the idealized version is basically a T, where you have like a broad sweep of biology and you fail very early. If you fail there and you can basically predict all the other stages and fail to begin at the outset, you've reduced the cost drastically. And so that's the idealized version, is what we like to call the T-shaped funnel. And we're not quite there yet, but we are making a lot of improvements compared to industry. And so that's kind of the mission. And like you said, we're able to apply that not just to rare diseases, but to all sorts of diseases, as long as we can model it within our cellular platform.
First of all, I think there are lots of businesses that want a T-shaped funnel.
Yeah, that's true.
That's my new aspirational goal. I think you started off by talking about stories. I'm a believer that, when something's personal, when people can see it, when it impacts people in their lives or even themselves, that's sort of when this mission even becomes more real, more powerful, going from sort of more rare diseases, or unfortunately things like cancer and oncology aren't so rare anymore, but to something like COVID, which is now impacting all of us, I imagine sort of helps to really ground that mission and make that feel even more pressing for people.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like during the pandemic, it was such at the very beginning, it was so uncertain those times, right? Everyone was freaking out. No one knew what the future held. And I remember the task force that got put on that, the COVID screening task force, they were so invigorated because like they felt, and they told me, they're like, Ben, like I can actually feel like I am fighting this thing and doing something that will help versus just sitting around and, seeing what, waiting around for what happens. Like if you're doing something to improve humanity, like you just feel better about yourself.
Yeah, it's also in this moment in time, I think, lack of feeling like agency, personal agency, and what you're describing is like the ultimate agency, and by playing like a real role in some of the most pressing problems we're facing as a society right now. And now I'll attempt to bring us back to sort of this hybrid of research and commercial applications. And so maybe sort of talking about like the business side of all of this incredible technology. And I think that is, to me, what feels rare, unfortunately, is I know there's incredible cutting edge research happening, but it doesn't always kind of find a home with sort of real commercial applications. And I'm just wondering, of course, I know pharma is a huge industry, right? We all see lots of pharmaceutical ads all the time, so I assume they have lots of money. I'd love to just learn a bit more about how that evolved, how you all found a business, how you became a public company and so successful in such short order, and just learn a bit more about sort of how these two worlds have fit together.
Historically, one of Recursion's main business models was around these rare diseases and the thought that we could repurpose existing drugs from other pharmaceutical companies to make drugs that were like further along in the clinical process but didn't pan out for the original indication. We could pivot them and like repurpose them to be used in rare diseases. So that was the original use case. We still can do that, but what we found is our platform is more powerful than just that. For us to really succeed in our mission, we feel so committed to what we find in terms of the drugs that we found that we just need to take them to clinic ourselves. And so originally we thought we wouldn't do that. We have shifted where we now are more vertically oriented pharma company with clinical development now in-house. But at the same time, we recognize that we can't do everything by ourselves. And so because of that, we've partnered with really good world-class pharma companies, such as Bayer for the area of fibrosis and Roche and Genentech in the area of neurology. And so these are areas that are extremely costly to really pursue. So just something we could not do on ourselves. But by partnering with them, we can use our platform to find hits and things that work, and then leverage their expertise to run the clinical trials and prosecute those findings. We have this hybrid approach. We prosecute our own things and take those to clinic, but the other things that are more capital intensive, we use partners. And so far, it's been a good blend. It wasn't like we knew this from day one. It was a lot of trial and error, lots of talking to people and finding their place. It wasn't until we really proved to the world with our own assets that people really took notice. When Bayer took a bet on us, that meant a lot to us. But they really caught the vision, and they've been great partners since.
And so, am I understanding that correctly? That sort of the first approach was really just proving you could do this, right? Proving results before you approached partners or tried to sort of commercialize it beyond yourselves.
In kind of the biotech land, the currency of success is really like assets in clinic. And so if you can get something to clinic and prove that it's working, and go through all the regulatory, bodies, FDA and such, it's really a proof point to investors that, hey, there's something here that might work. And so with a platform like ours, it's not going to be a single asset that proves that. We will run, tens of assets. And if that percentage is better than average, then that's an indication that the platform is doing its job. In order to get, buy-in from investors and partnerships, we really had to kind of put money where our mouth was and like really take things to clinic that we thought were really going to pan out based on the platform readings. We've had success, I think in, this rare disease I initially talked about, CCM, in March of this year, we had our first patient enroll in the randomized clinical trial. And so that was really cool to see that milestone happen, right? To finally have, patients start enrolling in this trial.
We are in a world where things like bad blood and all of these sort of like tech dramas of the moment are getting even more airtime. I think there's been some cynicism on healthcare innovation and technical approach, this sort of fail fast model. Kind of curious if you encountered any of that and how you have instilled so much trust to the market and to big companies as well.
When we show our partners our data, our internal data, and we have packets that show basically ground truth biology that our platform recapitulates. And when we show them that, they're kind of blown away. And we always try to really please our partners in terms of our speed and the quality of work. And when we do that, they just double down on us. And so I understand the skepticism that people have. But when you look at the results of the platform, it's really hard not to get excited about. And when you look at some of the speeds at which we've been able to find and then prosecute some of our earlier stage assets, it's just remarkable. And so it's yeah, the world is full of that kind of stuff, but the world also has amazing technology that we can leverage, and let's not be afraid to do that.
Yeah, I guess the short answer is it works and you can prove it. Right?
Yeah.
But tell us about this journey from sort of IC to Eng leader to then CTO, and not just CTO of any company, CTO of a public company, which I imagine also is quite a different beast.
I had a mentor once. I was asking him about being a CTO, and he was like, "Oh, I never want to be a CTO ever again." And I kind of honestly I feel that way as well. A good manager is probably someone who is reluctant to be one. I know that sounds kind of odd to say.
Well, I actually agree with all forms of leadership, right? The best leaders are the people who didn't actually want to be that leader. They just sort of had to. They had the thing it took in that moment. Yeah,
and so in my case, I still have a lot of historical, technical context on Recursion. But at the time, I took these roles not because I was anxious for that level of leadership, but I wanted to make the most impact I could. I came to Recursion I'm investing my career in here. I want to be able to do what will be most impactful. And at some point, it just became, if I could lead a team, that's more impactful than me doing it individually. And then it was well, if I could lead a team of teams, that would be more impactful. If I could lead a department. And so it was just this natural progression. And at each step of the way, it felt good, but also was a little part of me died because I wasn't doing the coding all day. And I think that what I feel is management and leadership can be extremely rewarding, but the payoffs that you get, they come at much slower cadence. When you're coding day to day, you get a dopamine hit every time you make the build go green or you release a new feature. But with leadership, you're talking more about okay, I'm spinning up this new office in Canada. We did that. And I was there a couple of weeks ago or last week, and we had 20 people there. And that felt really good to see that finally materialize. But that took a year to get there. It was not a 1 week effort. And so just the time scale at which things operate at the leadership level, you just have to recognize that it's much longer and you have to be okay with that and become comfortable.
Yeah, your success really is your team's success.
So that was a bunch of rambling, sorry.
No, it's great. I'm now going to push you on, I know you were reluctant, but what do you think made you successful? And how do you think you earned those progressions?
I was always very technical. My grandfather is an electrical engineer, and he taught me, from day one, all about computers. So that always got me very far in life in terms of my IC career. What has made me a good leader is probably what I learned from my mom about being empathetic and really caring about people and understanding what they're going through and relating to them and being there for people when they're going through hard times. So I would say empathy is a big aspect of leadership. The other thing that I would say that I have always done well is I'm an avid learner. I love learning about things. And so in software engineering, it was always, reading the latest blog posts, reading the latest paper with machine learning. With management, though, I just kind of devoured management books and just talked to tons of people. One of my favorite books is The Manager's Path by Camille Fournier. That's a great book. That was like, I read that. It was like 2016, 2017. And that really opened my eyes to what management could look like. But anyways, I think always be learning. You can never go wrong. If you place a bet on someone who's a learner, it's far better than someone who has a fixed mindset, who's just good at one thing and that's what they're good at. Don't be afraid to change your reading material as you're shifting careers. Because that's what it really is. It is a career shift. People don't recognize it as always, but like it is pretty drastic. You need to read all that background material if you want to be effective.
How do you flex, as you move into sort of people management and HR related, work and opening offices, right? Totally different stream. How do you still flex that sort of technical muscle? Of course, you're sort of shifting your focus, but I imagine as a technologist at heart, it's still a core of where your interests lie. How do you sort of get that fulfillment?
Yeah, so I found like early on, like as I was a director and VP even, I still did a lot of pull requests. I still reviewed a lot of people's work, whether that was the engineering side or data science side. And reviewing, I think you can scale that for a lot longer. Even that though, at some point becomes, like you will become the bottleneck. Like if you say like you have to review something, right? It's really hard for me to make contributions at technical level at the pace Recursion is operating right now, which makes me sad. And so really what I can do now is just keep up on all the great work that's being done and, read their posts, go to their meetings where they explain what they've been developing. And I think outside of that, I do think it's useful to have a creative outlet, but you just can't have that creative outlet be a bottleneck for other people. So do something like program or code on your own. I've been doing that a little bit with some side projects I've been doing, but they're not tied to Recursion at all.
It's super interesting. It's basically just finding, we are all multifaceted people, right? And so how do you get those outlets? But to your point, if you're going to be at a scaling company and what matters is speed, certainly for Recursion, you can't be doing anything to slow your team down. I imagine you're running with fairly cross-functional teams of not just technologists, but scientists. And how do these things work together? How does that change your leadership and the way you sort of operate on the technical side?
Yeah, so I would say just, operating cross-functionally is a core value of Recursion. So we have this value called One Recursion. And we have it because we believe our success is really dependent on us living that value. Early on, it was very easy to do this because we all fit in one conference room, and then we fit in like one small office, and there were just a few tables. Now, though, we're so big that like there's just a natural entropy to siloing functionally. And so the way we've structured the company is, while we have functions that serve as like kind of centers of excellence, like we have engineering and data science, and they're good at doing their respective function, and they should always be improving that craft. We have cross-functional structures that cut across the whole company. And so you'll always have leadership groups that are comprised of people from different functions, from biology, chemistry, data science, engineering, and they're leading the efforts of the company, really. So we have leadership teams that are cross-functional. And sometimes, once you get down to like the leaf node of like the teams doing the work, if the team is small enough, then you'll also have cross-functional teams. But if the effort is big enough, then it makes sense to have a team of engineers working on the app and a team of data scientists working on the methods for that app. And so we do see some, specialization does drive to that model, but at every point, we always have a leadership team that's cross-functional, because that's, again, we kind of feel like that's the secret sauce to Recursion, is that cross-disciplinary aspect of biotech meets tech, essentially.
Speaking of that, you have built your career in health and biotech and the intersection of technology. What are some of the things that get you most excited in the space, even beyond Recursion? What are the biggest problems or opportunities you see?
This is definitely not Recursion, but like, I don't know, when I look at the world of medicine right now, I just see it being so reactive. Like things could be so much better if we took a more proactive stance to health. The most effective medicine right now is still, in my opinion, exercise. And that's just why, like, at my last my last company, we actually incentivized people to walk more, right? Because we knew that would increase health outcomes. And so I don't know. For me, when I think about all the major technology that's happening, so the system itself is set up in such a way to not take advantage of that yet. And so I don't know. I feel like there's a reckoning where like we can shift from being more reactive in the healthcare space to be more proactive. And I don't know quite how that's going to happen, but like when it does, it's going to be amazing because we waste so much money by being reactive right now.
Yeah, no, I hear that. Definitely no shortage of opportunity in healthcare right now. Ben, so grateful that you joined us. It's been fascinating. I'm ready to leave my own company and come work for you.
Okay.
Your leadership style, your technical chops, the mission. I'm imagining I'm not alone. If people want to reach out to you or they're interested in working at Recursion or just learning more, how do they get in touch?
We continue to hire. We have some hires, some job openings on the website. You can go there and apply. Well, I'm on Twitter, bmaybe. I'm on GitHub as well, although my GitHub feed is sadly not too active these days. But bmaybe. I'm also on LinkedIn as Ben Maybe.
Awesome. I'm going to go follow you right now, and we'll be doing a Q&A after this. So thank you so much. This has been so much fun, and I'm excited to keep working together.
All right. Thanks, Jackie.
All right. Bye, everyone.